Before we started to write that story, we realized we need to reset our mental map of the continent because people have different perspectives on Africa. And so I'll ask you a few questions. The first question is, how big is the continent, right? If you compare Africa to India, China, Europe, North America, Japan, how big is it? Many people don't know this, by the way. But yes, so we're larger than all of these combined, right? And you then some. So those of us who travel around the continent, you can realize this quite easily. The second is there were, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in 2018, how many were in Africa? The answer is 6, right? The interesting thing is the top 2 in the world were in Africa, right? Adrian talked about Ethiopia, but Ghana as well. You have Cote d'Ivoire that's growing quite tremendously these days. You have small countries like Djibouti as well, right? And then you have Senegal and Tanzania. So the top 10 fastest growing economies last year, 6 were on the continent. Third question. The World Bank publishes an index every year, the Ease of Doing Business Index, right? And typically they have the top 10 reformers in the world. Again, of the top 10 reformers in the last year's report, which was then for 2017, how many were in Africa? All right, the answer is 5. So 5 of the top 10, right? And some, again, are some of the fastest growing, right? So Djibouti is on there, Cote d'Ivoire is on there. But you have a smaller country like Togo, amazing reforms. Rwanda has been on that list for a long time, as you know. And then Kenya as well, right? So of the top 10 economies that done the most reforms last year, or in 2017, 5 were in Africa. And finally, well, Adrian, thank you for asking that question. How many companies make $1 billion of revenue? Let's see who wasn't listening. And the answer is actually not 400, it's 438 as per our database. It took us, we actually published this number, which was about 2 years ago. And it took us 3 months to gather this data, right, of a full-time consultant. I think Claudia was on that project. It took us 3 months to gather this data because it just doesn't exist, right? And so we have company by company, and we looked around, leveraging a lot of the work we had done, leveraging some of the reports that have been published, but also leveraging our offices to really understand the number of these companies that are not public, right? Only 40% of the companies are listed, 60% are private. And so we have them all. We then updated then we found 396. We then updated the database over the last few months, and the number is now 438, right? So the 438, when we ask this question generally, before, if Adrian had not given me the answer, the typical answer we get is 50 to 150. That's typically the answer we get, right? Sometimes people venture and say 200, right? But everybody is surprised by this. We've asked it to 5,000 or so people, I would say, reckon. The only 2 people who've gotten it right, and one is Aliko Dangote. I always say that. It's very interesting. But there are 438 companies. What's interesting is for the listed companies, the 40% that are listed, we're then able to compare their performance to that of listed companies around the world. And we can then show that these companies grow faster and actually more profitable on a local currency basis than the global peers, right? Which is why Africa tends to be quite attractive these days to global institutions. So those are the questions. But if we get back to the book, right? So, we started by saying, what are the key trends that are shaping the continent today? And let's try to identify them. And we found 5, right? And in typical, I always say South African fashion, we call them the big 5. So let's share them with you.
We have a young, fast-growing and urban population that's creating a lot of, unmet demand, with a lot of unmet demands. And each of those words is extremely important. So first of all, young. Anybody tell me what they think the average or the median age in Africa is? Very good, 20, it is 20. So somebody's, so absolutely right. So the median age of 20, and in Nigeria, for example, there's more babies born in Nigeria than the whole of Western Europe in any one year, right? So if you're a nappy company or a baby food company, you can't ignore what's happening in Nigeria. And obviously the youth of the continent presents an opportunity for a huge demographic dividend, which should help our growth in a world that is otherwise aging. So for global investors looking around the world, this is a very important fact to think about. It's fast growing. So the population of Africa today is 1.2 billion people. By 2050, it'll be 2.4 billion, right? So today that 1.2 billion is 1 for every 6 people in the world. By 2050, that'll be 1 of every 4 people in the world, okay? By the end of this century, the population will be over 4 billion, which will be 1 in every 3 people will be on the African continent. So again, if you're a business executive looking around the world, it's very difficult to ignore that insight. Thirdly, as a continent, we're urbanizing at a terrific rate. So about 24 million Africans join the urban centers every year. There's about 100 cities today that have over 1 million residents, and that's more than the whole of North America today. And all those statistics are increasing at a terrific rate. And the thing with urbanization is it increases productivity. So urban populations are usually twice the productivity of rural populations. Again, very important. We spoke to Tidjane Thiam, the CEO of Credit Suisse, and he drew an analogy to when he used to work in Asia for Prudential. And he said, when you have a region where you combine fast-growing populations with rapidly rising per capita incomes, that just creates the really explosive demand, and which is what fueled the businesses he ran in Asia. And he very much sees that possibility here in Africa. And all these people, of course, have needs for connectivity, for energy, for consumer goods that to a large degree are unmet. So the business opportunity implicit in that trend is enormous.
Now, somebody has to meet that demand, right? And the good news is increasingly that demand is being met in Africa, right? So we started by trying to figure out how much we actually manufacture on the continent today, right? And we couldn't find any data that told us this is how much we manufacture. So again, it took us quite a few months of some of our colleagues to really do a bottom-up by country, by product, to understand how much we manufacture on the continent today. And we found that we actually manufacture $500 billion worth of goods today. 70% of those are manufactured in-country for in-country consumption. About 10% are manufactured in-country and exported across Africa, which ties a bit to the 12% intra-Africa trade. And then 20% are manufactured in-country and exported across the world, right? Now, we believe that actually could double, right? If you look at our manufacturing rate, we've actually not done a great job so far. We grow manufacturing on the continent about 2.5% a year. Just to give you a sense, China grows its manufacturing sector at 15% a year. Vietnam grows it at 13.5%, and that's been for the last 15 years consistently. We've grown at the global average of 2.5%. So a ton needs to be done here, and the good news is a lot more is happening. So the governments are working with the private sector across all of these areas that Mutsa talked about to fulfill this consumer need, right? Whether it's for what we call regional processing, for consumer good products, whether it's a labor-intensive manufacturing like we've seen in takeoff in places like Ethiopia, or in small countries like Swaziland, whether it's resource-intensive manufacturing, right? So what you use when you have, say, cheap gas, and Nigeria is doing quite a bit of that, and some of the countries that have resources are doing that. So we're seeing a much bigger trend when it comes to this industrial revolution that's taking place across the continent.